Go ahead and find your seat. I want to draw your attention back to Ecclesiastes chapter 1 this morning. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. A pastor asked a rabbi, this isn't a joke, it's a true story. A pastor asked a rabbi what the modern Jewish community thought of Ecclesiastes, and the rabbi answered with one word: depressing. Here's the thing, though. At the end of this book, at the end of Ecclesiastes 12, verse 11, the author of Ecclesiastes, or narrator, says that the words of the preacher are goads and nails, and they've been given us by the one shepherd. A goad is meant to turn us in the right direction. A nail is meant to hold down what might otherwise blow away or fall apart. My desire for this series is that as we walk through the book of Ecclesiastes, you will have a different answer than that of the rabbi. Because there is honest hope in these pages. And these words have been given to you by the one good shepherd. Now, last week we looked at the first 11 verses of this book. We talked about the word translated vanity, and said other options are absurd or futile, smoke, breath, or meaninglessness. One Old Testament commentator humorously translates this Hebrew word havel, soap bubbles. Soap bubbles, soap bubbles. Everything is soap bubbles, is what he says. The question that the preacher of Ecclesiastes invited us to walk away with last week was, if you only have one life, how should you spend it? Now, this week, I want you to think about this. When you go out to eat and the waiter comes around to ask you if you would like dessert, what's the proper response? It's certainly not no. It's what are my options, right? I want to know what are my options. And this week, the preacher tells us of all our options. Here are the ways you can spend your life, the preacher reports. And here's our question from the text. In a broken world, are some options still better than others? In a broken world, are some options still better than others? Follow along as I read. I'm going to begin in verse 12 of chapter 1, and we're going to read all the way through to the end of chapter 2. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is but a striving after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also is vanity. I said of laughter, it's mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceived that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For of the wise, as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance. Seeing that the days to come all will have been for long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. For all is vanity and a striving after wind. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the busyness of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. John Guerrera sings, I say yes to these limits, but there's a limit to my yes. Let's pray as we talk about this text. Lord God, we're grateful for your word. To be honest, sometimes we get lost in it. We're not sure how to understand it. We're not sure how to live it. We're not sure why you gave it to us. In order to cut through the fog, in order to hear you and see you, we need the Spirit. We need the Spirit to do a work that we cannot do. We need him to bring the word of God to life in our hearts, in our midst. In your precious name, we ask you for this. Amen. The preacher gives himself to a full-hearted examination of life under the sun. If you looked in verse 12 and 13, he talks about his position and then his deliberation, his intentionality. He says, I applied my heart to seek out and to search out wisdom. So as we listen to his testimony, we are meant to dismiss the argument of, well, he didn't mean it. He didn't try hard enough. He didn't give it all he's got. He's saying to us, I gave everything I had to this search. I tried. I meant it. I did it with my eyes wide open, with every resource at my disposal. I gave myself to this experiment. And here's what he discovered. Look at verse 13. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. It's an unhappy business. He says, this life is a heavy burden. And then he's going to go about trying to answer the questions, how do we lighten the load? How do we make a heavy life bearable, the preacher asks. And he begins on his quest. First, he learns that being wise won't keep you safe. Look at chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. He says, I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. But I perceive that this is also but a striving after the wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he increases knowledge, increases sorrow. If we turn over to verse 12 of chapter 2, he says, I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly. But in verse 14, the wise person has his eyes in his head. The fool walks in darkness. Yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. As one teacher wrote, if ignorance is bliss, then this pupil is going to be the happiest person in the world. The preacher's getting at that little truth that we hold on to. Ignorance is bliss. And he's saying it's true. Because as another preacher said, the more you know you don't know. And so if we think, hey, I can make life easier by being the smartest person in the room. I can make this life more bearable if I don't make the dumb mistakes that others make. There may be some truth to that. But in your path, in your search, in your acquisition of wisdom, you will undoubtedly come upon sorrow. It's as if the preacher is saying to parents and to grandparents, you can either have happy children or wise children, but you can't have both. If you're committed to keeping your children from sorrow, you will also keep them from wisdom. Those paths walk together. So being wise won't keep you safe. It won't keep you from the painful things of this life. It might instead deepen your pain. How about having a good time? Will having a good time lighten life's load? The preacher says having a good time won't keep you from sorrow. If being wise won't keep you safe, having a good time won't keep you from sorrow. Maybe you're here and you think, what if I have more fun and experience more of life than anyone else? Well, the preacher here experiences laughter and alcohol, art, nature, money, stuff, music, power, sex, affirmation, and work. And after all this, what's his conclusion? Look at verse 11 of chapter 2. I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. You say, if I had more money to experience more things, then life would have fullness. It would have meaning. It would have purpose. And the preacher says, no, that won't do it. You might have days of laughter. You might have weeks of delight and joy, but it's going to fade. You can fill your house with all sorts of distractions, but the distractions are not an end. Now, maybe you grew up in church and you're hearing the preacher's description and you might be thinking, are we supposed to do that? I want to remind you, the Bible is sometimes descriptive, not prescriptive. So the preacher is not telling you what you should do. He's telling you, if you went down this path, here's what you'd discover. You can hook up as much as you want. You can drink as much as you want. You can get as much money and power as you could possibly acquire. It's going to be smoke. It's going to be disappointing. It's not going to make the heavy load of life more bearable. So being wise won't keep you safe. Having a good time won't keep you from sorrow. Next, the preacher says, your hard work can't fix the world and you won't be here to enjoy it. Look at chapter 1 and verse 15. He says, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. You and I can pour ourselves into this world. We can give everything we've got to making it different and better. And when we die, it'll still be broken. When I was in between college and graduate school, one of the jobs that I did was I built decks and fences for a season. And often when we would begin placing the deck boards down, some of them would be twisted. And so we would get a hammer and we would leverage that board in place, and then when we got it where we want it, we would screw it down. We would make a crooked board straight. But if you go back and you look at those decks years later, or you look at your deck where somebody did something similar, you see that board has worked its way loose. Those screws could not hold it straight forever. And even now, there's places where you stub your toe and get splinters because you can't make a crooked board straight. See, the preacher, he does things he's not supposed to do, and it leads him to say things we're not supposed to say. Look at chapter 2 and verse 17. He says, I hated life. Can we say that? Maybe if you're sitting with a friend and you're having a drink, or you're sitting on a fishing boat with a rod in your hand, and that friend says to you, I hate life. You might think to yourself, I need to make a phone call. I don't know what to do about that. And here we have a preacher telling us about the ways of wisdom. And he declares to us, I hated life. Now what's interesting is in the wisdom literature, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, there are other wise voices who say similar things. Job will say, I hate the day I was born. David will say, all I've known is pain and sorrow. So the preacher here is not actually all that different from some other voices that we've read and heard. And truthfully, maybe we can't say it, but have we not thought it? Have there not been moments where we've thought, I hate life? Just one hit after another. I fix one thing and two more things break. I live in a world, it's not the way it's supposed to be. I mean, if we look back into the story, into Genesis 1 and 2, we see God creates a world and he makes it good. And he walks with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day, and they have fruit trees to pick from, and they're living in a garden. And they only have one rule. But then sin enters the world in Genesis chapter 3. And ever since then, ever since that rupture, that disconnection, rules on top of rules have been added to try and piece the world back together, to try and make things that are crooked straight. But when we lay our head on our pillow at night, when we wake up in a cold sweat, we know things are not right. And we hate that about life. This preacher is not a cynic. He's not a man who delights in rage. Rather, he's a man who looks at the world as it is and laments what could be. Look what he says. I hated life because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after the wind. This emptiness, this futility, that's not the way it was. That's not the way it's supposed to be. And the preacher knows that. He says in verse 18, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. Any of us who have hired a carpenter or a plumber to come in and fix the work that another man has done have heard the words, I don't know what this guy was thinking. The man who comes after you will see things differently than you did. And the person you will leave your work to will not do that work in the way that you would. This leads the preacher to despair. Verse 20, so I turned about and I gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. Can you hear him? Can you feel him? Do you resonate? Maybe the preacher is saying things that we've said in the quiet. Zach Eswine captures it this way: God holds us together, even the vexed and harassed among us. The wise who believe this learn not to fear revealing what is true about their despair or hatred. God's character and covenant anchor their voice and make every feeling and thought, no matter how beautiful or foul, a matter of prayer for God to enter, of presence with God to keep, of paraphernalia for God to redeem. I'm grateful that some of you have told me I was mad at God. Often I get in my car and I yell at him. I don't know what to do with what he's put in my life. So I talk to him about it. As we said last week, Ecclesiastes is not talking about the world as it should be. It's talking about the world as we know it. And so we live in a world where we know, Solomon, the preacher, knows there are good things in the world. But there's so many things in the world I don't understand. And I have to live in that tension. I have to pray through that tension. I have to have faith while I walk that tense line. And the ultimate expression of that, the thing that led the preacher to that, we actually see in verse 16. The end of verse 16, he says, the wise dies just like the fool. The ultimate expression of a broken world is death. Jesus stood by the tomb of his friend Lazarus, and he bellows with rage because death is in the world. See, wisdom, pleasure, and hard work can't stop death. Death will come for us all the same. David Gibson writes, the reality is that if death doesn't inform the way we live, then death is something we are pretending does not exist. The preacher says, let's burst the bubbles. Let's stop pretending. Let's talk about the world as it is. I mean, after saying all this, what does the preacher say? What conclusion does he come to? Look at verse 24. He says, there's nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? How do we square that with his words in chapter 1, verse 13? He said there, it is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. How do we mesh these things? Haddon Robinson writes, wise people know that the world is bankrupt. They don't have any coinage to get it out of debt. Someday that will dawn on you if it hasn't already. And what do you do when you face that futility in life? Do you live it up? Do you give up? This preacher says there's something better to do. That is, you can look up. The preacher examines the rubble around him, his inability to change it, the recognition that he will be forgotten, that his toil is smoke. And rather than quitting in despair, rather than grabbing what he can before the ship goes down, he looks up, doesn't he? He says, this is from the hand of God. To square these statements, we have to imagine something. We have to imagine that God gave us good things, but the good things he gave us are not meant to be ends of themselves. So if you and I continue to go to the world as an end, it will be like going to a bag of chips to satiate our hunger. It won't work. The bag's gonna be empty, and you'll still be hungry. Trust me. The world wasn't meant to satiate you. The world was meant to be an appetizer. The things that you love in this world will be better in the presence of Jesus. The grace that you're given is meant to bring you home. The preacher is asking us to consider life as a gift from God and not an ultimate source of gain for ourselves. So when Jesus shows up and he says, in the world you will have tribulation, it's a heavy burden. But take heart. I've overcome the world. Dear ones, we live in a broken world, but it's a broken world that has been overcome by Jesus. And the preacher wants to help us live in that world. The Old Testament commentator William Barrick says that the message here can be boiled down to live without reserve, die without regret. Live without reserve, die without regret. Let me explain that a little bit. The preacher has said that both the wise and the foolish die. So is he saying that they're equivalent ways of living? No. We'll develop this more in coming weeks. But he says it's better to live wisely. If you end your life having pursued wisdom, you will end with fewer regrets than you will if you pursue folly. We know Solomon's story. We know that he asked for wisdom and God made him a wiser person than everybody in the world. And even Solomon, in all his wisdom, was still foolish in places. He didn't know what to do when it came to other human beings. He used them for his own means, his own gain, his own delight and pleasure, regardless of how that made them feel, regardless of whether or not that acknowledged that they were men and women created with dignity and honor and worth. So we can be wise in one area and foolish in another. But that doesn't mean we throw wisdom out. If we're going to live without reserve and we're going to die without regret, we're going to need to live wisely. We're going to need to apply our hearts. Wisdom will not save us from death, but wisdom is better than folly. So the preacher is going to ask you again, in a broken world, are some options better than others? You know,